I should have known something was wrong the moment the realtor wouldn't meet us at the house after sunset. My name is David Morrison, and 3 years ago, my family and I bought what we thought was our dream home in Salem, Oregon. A beautiful Victorian house built in 1892, with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and enough space for our growing family. The price was incredible, almost $40,000 below market value. We thought we'd hit the jackpot. We had no idea we'd bought a gateway to hell. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt like you got a deal that was too good to be true, because looking back, every red flag was there. We just chose to ignore them. The house had been on the market for 2 years. 2 years. In Salem's competitive housing market, that should have been our first warning. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, had lived there for 37 years before suddenly deciding to move to Arizona. When we asked the realtor why they were selling, she just said they wanted a change of climate. But Mrs. Henderson had lived in Oregon her entire life. Why would someone uproot their entire existence after nearly 4 decades in the same house? The second red flag was during our home inspection. Our inspector, Mike Patterson, had been doing this job for over 20 years. He was thorough, professional, and never seemed fazed by anything. But when he came up from the basement after his initial survey, his face was pale. He said the basement was structurally sound, but recommended we consider updating the space extensively before using it for storage or recreation. Hit the like button if you're already getting a bad feeling about this basement, because it gets so much worse. When we asked what he meant, Mike just shook his head and said, "Some houses carry the energy of their previous occupants more than others. This basement, it feels heavy. I'd recommend having it blessed before you move in." We laughed it off. Mike was a practical guy, not someone we'd expect to talk about house energy or blessings. We figured he was just being overly cautious. The third warning came from our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly Korean woman who lived next door. On our second day in the house, she brought over homemade kimchi and cookies for our kids. She seemed lovely, but as she was leaving, she grabbed my arm and whispered, "Whatever you do, don't let your children play in the basement alone. And if you hear chanting at night, call the police immediately." I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head and said, "The Hendersons were good people, but they let bad people use their house. Bad people who did bad things downstairs." Before I could ask more questions, she hurried back to her house and wouldn't answer when we knocked on her door later. My wife Sarah thought Mrs. Chen was just being superstitious, possibly dealing with some early dementia. We decided not to let her cryptic warnings influence our excitement about our new home. After all, we'd gotten our dream house in our dream location. What could go wrong? Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, because what we discovered in that basement changed everything we thought we knew about the supernatural world. The first month in the house was actually wonderful. The kids, Emma and Jake, ages 8 and 10, loved their new rooms. Sarah was thrilled with the kitchen and the garden space. I was already planning how to convert the basement into a home office and entertainment room. Everything seemed perfect. The basement itself was partially finished. About half of it had been converted into a rec room with wood paneling and carpet, while the other half remained unfinished storage space with concrete floors and exposed beams. The previous owners had left behind some furniture, a couch, a coffee table, and oddly what looked like a small altar table in the unfinished section. When I asked the realtor about the altar table during our final walkthrough, she said the Hendersons had been very spiritual people and had used the space for meditation. It seemed harmless enough, so we decided to leave it there until we started our renovations. The first strange incident happened about 6 weeks after we moved in. Sarah was doing laundry in the basement when she heard what sounded like multiple voices whispering. She couldn't make out words, but she said it sounded like several people having a quiet conversation somewhere in the walls. When she called out, asking if anyone was there, the whispering stopped immediately. Comment below if you've ever heard unexplained voices in your house, because this was just the beginning of our supernatural nightmare. Sarah mentioned it to me that evening, but we rationalized it. Old houses make noise. Maybe it was the heating system, or sound carrying from neighbors' houses, or even just the wind moving through the old ductwork. We didn't think much of it. The second incident happened 2 weeks later. I was down in the basement measuring spaces for my planned renovations when I noticed something odd about the altar table. When we'd first seen it, it had been completely bare except for some dust. But now, there were small objects on it. A black candle, a small wooden bowl, and what looked like a piece of raw quartz crystal. I called upstairs to Sarah, asking if she'd put anything on the table. She hadn't. When I asked the kids, they said they rarely went down to the basement because it felt weird. Emma, our 8-year-old, said the basement made her feel like someone was watching her, even when she was alone. I examined the objects more closely. The candle looked old, with wax drippings around its base suggesting it had been burned many times. The wooden bowl had what looked like burn marks inside it, and when I picked up the crystal, it was surprisingly warm to the touch, even though the basement was always cool. Let me know in the comments what you think was happening here, because we were about to discover the truth about our house's dark history. I decided to research the property's history. What I found made my blood run cold. Our house hadn't just been owned by the Hendersons for 37 years. Before them, it had been owned by a woman named Margaret Thorne from 1954 to 1986. Margaret Thorne had been a practicing occultist who had regularly hosted what she called spiritual gatherings in her basement. According to newspaper archives I found at the Salem Public Library, Margaret had been investigated by police multiple times in the 1970s and early 1980s for disturbing the peace. Neighbors had complained about loud chanting, strange smells, and unusual activities happening at all hours of the night. But since no laws were being broken, the police couldn't do anything beyond issuing noise violations. The most disturbing article I found was from 1986, just before Margaret sold the house to the Hendersons. The headline read, "Local woman hospitalized after claiming demonic attack." The article described how Margaret Thorne had been found by paramedics in her basement, unconscious and covered in what appeared to be self-inflicted scratches. She claimed that a spiritual entity she had been working with had turned violent and attacked her. Hit the like button if this story is giving you chills, because what we discovered next proved that Margaret's claims might not have been delusions. Margaret had spent 3 weeks in psychiatric evaluation before being released. She sold the house immediately afterward and moved to a care facility in Portland, where she died just 6 months later. The cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac failure, but she was only 53 years old with no prior heart conditions. When I shared this information with Sarah, she was troubled but still skeptical. "Mental illness can make people believe a lot of things," she said. "That doesn't mean our house is actually haunted." But she agreed that we should probably get rid of the altar table and anything else that might have belonged to Margaret. That weekend, we decided to clear out the basement completely and start fresh. What we found when we moved the altar table changed everything. Underneath the table, carved directly into the concrete floor, was a large pentagram surrounded by symbols I didn't recognize. The carving was deep and precise, clearly done with professional tools over many hours or days. But that wasn't the worst part. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because what happened next still gives me nightmares. Inside the pentagram, the concrete was stained dark brown. At first, I thought it might be rust or old water damage, but when I knelt down to examine it more closely, I could smell something metallic and organic. Sarah took one look at the stains and immediately called the kids to come upstairs and stay there. We decided to call the police. When Officer Martinez arrived and saw the basement, his expression became very serious. He asked us to wait upstairs while he examined the scene and made some phone calls. After about an hour, he came back up with a detective and what appeared to be a crime scene photographer. Detective Williams explained that they would need to test the stains to determine what they were, but based on the carved symbols and the setup, this appeared to be evidence of occult ritual activity. He said they'd seen similar setups in cases involving animal sacrifice and other illegal ritual practices. "The good news," Detective Williams said, "is that these symbols and stains appear to be very old, probably decades old. Whatever was happening here stopped long before you moved in. The bad news is that you're going to want to have this professionally cleaned and probably blessed by whatever religious authority you're comfortable with." Subscribe for more terrifying true stories, because the police investigation was just the beginning of our supernatural ordeal. The crime lab results came back 2 weeks later. The stains tested positive for animal blood, multiple types including chicken, goat, and something they couldn't identify. But they also found traces of human blood. Not enough to suggest serious harm, Detective Williams assured us, probably just from minor cuts during ritual practices. Still, the knowledge that both animal sacrifice and human blood rituals had been performed in our basement was deeply disturbing. Sarah wanted to move out immediately. She'd been researching occult practices online and had convinced herself that our house was spiritually contaminated. But we'd put every penny we had into buying the house, and the thought of losing that investment was devastating. We decided to have the basement professionally cleaned and blessed, then seal the pentagram under new concrete flooring. The blessing was performed by Father Mackenzie from St. Mary's Catholic Church. He was an older priest who'd been in Salem for over 30 years and had actually known Margaret Thorne personally. When I told him what we'd found, his face became grave. Margaret was a troubled woman who got involved with things she didn't understand, he said. She believed she could control spiritual forces through ritual magic, but she ended up opening doorways she couldn't close. I tried to help her many times, but she was convinced she knew better than centuries of church teaching about spiritual warfare. Comment below what you think Father Mackenzie meant by doorways she couldn't close, because his next words terrified us. Father Mackenzie performed a full house blessing, paying special attention to the basement. But as he was finishing the ritual in the basement, he stopped mid-prayer and stared at the corner where the altar table had been. His face went pale, and he quickly finished the blessing and asked us to come upstairs. "I need to be honest with you," he said once we were in the living room. "I felt a presence in that basement, something that didn't leave when Margaret did. The blessing I performed should help, but if you experience any unusual activity, strange sounds, unexplained cold spots, objects moving, or any sense of being watched, you need to call me immediately." We thanked Father Mackenzie and hoped his blessing would be enough. For about a month, everything seemed normal. The basement felt lighter somehow, and even the kids said it didn't feel weird anymore. We had new concrete poured over the pentagram and started converting the space into the family room we'd originally planned. But then Jake started having nightmares. Let me know in the comments if your children have ever had unexplained nightmares after moving to a new house, because what Jake was experiencing was beyond normal childhood fears. Jake, who had always been a great sleeper, suddenly started having vivid nightmares every single night. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, talking about the man in the basement who wanted him to come downstairs. When we asked him to describe the man, Jake said he was tall and thin, with dark eyes that looked like holes. The man would stand at the bottom of the basement stairs and call Jake's name, promising to show him special things if he would just come down alone. Sarah and I were concerned, but initially attributed the nightmares to the stress of moving and learning about the house's disturbing history. Kids pick up on adult anxiety, and we'd definitely been stressed about the basement discovery. We thought the nightmares would fade with time, but then Emma started seeing the man too. Emma's encounters were different. She would be playing in her room when she'd suddenly run to find us, saying the dark man was standing in her doorway, just watching her. When we'd go to check, no one was there. But Emma insisted she could still feel him nearby, hiding in the shadows. Hit the like button if you think we should have left the house immediately, because looking back, that's exactly what we should have done. The children's encounters escalated quickly. Jake started sleepwalking, and we would find him standing at the top of the basement stairs in the middle of the night, as if he was about to go downstairs. When we'd wake him up, he'd have no memory of leaving his bed. Emma began refusing to be alone in any room, saying the dark man was getting braver, and following her around the house during the day. Sarah and I started taking shifts, staying awake at night to watch the kids. During one of my night shifts, I finally saw what they'd been talking about. It was around 2 a.m., and I was sitting in the living room reading, listening for any sounds from the kids' rooms. I heard footsteps coming from the basement, slow, deliberate steps moving across the floor we'd just had renovated. I grabbed a flashlight and baseball bat and went to investigate. The basement was empty, but I could feel something watching me. The temperature in the room had dropped at least 20 degrees, and I could see my breath in the flashlight beam. As I was about to leave, I heard a voice, deep, male, and coming from directly behind me. They belong to me now. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments, because this voice changed everything for our family. I spun around, swinging the flashlight beam across the basement, but saw nothing. The voice had been so clear, so close, that I should have been face to face with whoever spoke. But the basement was empty except for the renovated furniture and my own terror. I ran upstairs and immediately woke Sarah. We checked on the kids. Both were sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. But I knew what I'd heard, and I knew our house blessing hadn't worked. Something was still there, and it was targeting our children. The next morning, I called Father Mackenzie and told him what I'd experienced. He listened quietly, then said something that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Morrison, what Margaret summoned 37 years ago was never banished. It's been waiting all this time for new occupants, especially children. Children's spiritual energy is purer and stronger than adults, making them easier targets for entities that feed on fear and innocence. Subscribe if you want to hear more about how we fought back against this supernatural threat, because what Father Mackenzie told us next changed our entire understanding of what we were dealing with." Father Mackenzie explained that Margaret Thorne hadn't just been practicing harmless ritual magic. According to church records and police reports from the 1980s, she had been attempting to summon and control what demonologists call a shadow entity, a malevolent spirit that exists in the space between our world and darker spiritual realms. These entities, Father Mackenzie said, are attracted to places where the spiritual barrier has been weakened through repeated occult practices. Margaret's decades of ritual work in your basement created what we call a thin place, an area where supernatural entities can more easily manifest in our physical world. The priest explained that shadow entities typically target children because their natural spiritual defenses haven't fully developed yet. The entity that had been summoned in our basement had been dormant during the Hendersons' occupation because they were deeply religious people who regularly blessed their home and maintained strong spiritual protection. But when we moved in, a family with no particular religious practices or spiritual protections, the entity saw an opportunity to finally claim the victims it had been promised decades ago. Comment below what you think we should have done at this point, because our situation was about to become life-threatening. Father Mackenzie recommended we perform a full exorcism of the house, but he warned us that the process could make the entity more aggressive before it was successfully banished. Shadow entities don't leave willingly, he said. When they realize they're being forced out, they often make desperate attempts to claim their intended victims before the exorcism is complete. Sarah and I discussed our options. We could try to sell the house, but we'd have to disclose the supernatural activity to potential buyers, making it nearly impossible to sell. We could continue living with the entity, but its targeting of our children was escalating and could become dangerous. Or we could stay and fight for our home through spiritual warfare we didn't fully understand. We decided to fight. Father Mackenzie scheduled the exorcism for the following Saturday, giving us a week to prepare. He instructed us to remove all mirrors from the basement area, as entities sometimes use reflective surfaces to manifest more strongly. He also gave us blessed salt to sprinkle around the children's bedrooms and taught us specific prayers to recite if we felt the entity's presence. That week was the most terrifying of our lives. The entity seemed to sense that we were planning to banish it, and its activities became more aggressive and frequent. Let me know if you want me to continue with part 2 of this script, because what happened during the exorcism week will haunt me forever. On Monday night, all the lights in the house began flickering simultaneously at exactly 3 a.m. The flickering lasted for 17 minutes, and during that time, we could hear what sounded like dozens of voices chanting in a language we didn't recognize. The chanting was coming from the basement, but when I went to investigate, the basement was silent and empty. Tuesday night, Jake's bedroom door began opening and closing on its own. Every time we'd close it, it would slowly swing open again within minutes. Emma refused to sleep in her own room and insisted on sleeping between Sarah and me. Even with both children in our bed, we could hear footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway outside our bedroom all night long. Wednesday night was when the entity made direct physical contact with our family. Sarah was tucked into bed with both kids when she felt something grab her ankle and pull her toward the foot of the bed. She screamed and kicked, waking up all of us. When I turned on the lights, we could see distinct finger marks on Sarah's ankle. 5 long, thin bruises that looked like someone with impossibly long fingers had grabbed her. Hit the like button if this story is terrifying you, because Thursday night was even worse. Thursday night, the entity appeared to Jake in full form. Jake woke us up screaming that the dark man was standing at the foot of his bed, pointing at him and speaking in the same strange language we'd heard during the chanting. But this time, Sarah and I could see it too. The figure was exactly as Jake had described. Tall, impossibly thin, with eyes that looked like empty holes in a face that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was wearing what appeared to be a long, dark robe, and when it pointed at Jake, we could see that its fingers were far too long for a human hand. The entity stared at us for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, then simply faded away like smoke. But before it disappeared completely, it spoke one word in perfect English: Saturday. It knew about the exorcism. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because part 1 of our supernatural survival story ends here, but the real battle was just beginning. Friday night, the entity didn't appear at all. The house was completely quiet for the first time in weeks. Father Mackenzie had warned us this might happen, that entities sometimes withdraw before an exorcism to gather their strength for a final confrontation. The calm before the spiritual storm. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with an unusual fog that seemed to cling specifically to our house while leaving the rest of the neighborhood clear. Father Mackenzie arrived at 10 a.m. with 2 other priests, Father Rodriguez, who specialized in spiritual deliverance, and Father Thomas, a younger priest who would be observing and learning. As they prepared their equipment, holy water, blessed candles, crucifixes, and an ancient leather-bound book of exorcism prayers, the temperature in our house began dropping steadily. By the time they were ready to begin, we could see our breath indoors, and frost was forming on the windows despite the fact that it was a mild October day outside. Father Mackenzie looked at us gravely and said, "Whatever happens during the next few hours, do not enter the basement until we call for you. Keep the children upstairs and keep them praying. This entity has had decades to grow stronger, and it will not leave without a fight." The 3 priests descended into our basement at exactly 11 a.m., and within minutes, we could hear them beginning the ancient Latin prayers of exorcism. What followed was the most terrifying 4 hours of our lives. The entity's response was immediate and violent. The entire house began shaking as if we were experiencing an earthquake. But outside, the neighborhood was completely still. Picture frames fell from walls, dishes crashed in the kitchen cabinets, and the children's toys in their rooms began moving on their own, spinning, flying across rooms, and arranging themselves into disturbing patterns. Comment below if you've ever experienced unexplained object movement in your home, because what happened next proved we were dealing with something far more powerful than we'd realized. Emma and Jake huddled with Sarah and me in our bedroom as the supernatural chaos erupted around us. We could hear the priests' voices growing stronger and more urgent as they continued their prayers, but we could also hear something else, a deep, inhuman roaring that seemed to come from the very foundation of the house. The roaring grew louder and more aggressive as the exorcism continued. It wasn't just sound. It was a presence that we could feel in our bones, a malevolent force that was being cornered and was fighting back with everything it had. The temperature continued dropping until ice began forming on the inside of our bedroom windows, and our breath came out in thick clouds. At 12:30 p.m., the house suddenly went completely silent. The shaking stopped, the roaring ceased, and even the priests' voices from the basement became quiet. Sarah and I looked at each other, wondering if it was over, if the entity had been successfully banished. Then we heard Father Mackenzie scream, "Hit the like button if you're on the edge of your seat, because what we discovered when we ran downstairs changed everything we thought we knew about spiritual warfare." Against Father Mackenzie's specific instructions, I ran toward the basement when I heard him scream. Sarah stayed with the children, barricading them in our bedroom. As I reached the top of the basement stairs, I could see strange lights flickering below. Not electric lights, but an eerie, greenish glow that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. I called down to the priests, but received no response. The silence was worse than the chaos had been. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly descended the stairs, praying harder than I ever had in my life. What I found in the basement will haunt me forever. All 3 priests were standing in different corners of the room, completely motionless. Their eyes rolled back so only the whites showed. They were still breathing, but they seemed to be in some kind of trance or possession state. The greenish light was emanating from the center of the room, where the old pentagram had been carved under our new concrete. The new concrete flooring had cracked in a perfect pentagram shape, and the dark stains we thought we'd sealed away were seeping through the cracks, glowing with that same eerie light. But worse than any of that was the figure standing in the center of the pentagram. Share this video with someone who loves supernatural horror, because what I saw next proved that some entities are far more powerful than any blessing or exorcism. The shadow entity had manifested in full physical form. It was even more terrifying than the glimpse we'd caught in Jake's bedroom. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, it appeared to be made of living darkness that absorbed all light around it. Its face was a void where features should have been, except for those terrible hollow eyes that seemed to look directly into my soul. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. From the walls, from the air itself, from inside my own head. "You invited me in when you disturbed my sacred space," the entity said. "You awakened me when you tried to seal away my altar. Now I will take what was promised to me 37 years ago. Your children will serve me as Margaret's children never could." I tried to speak, to pray, to do anything, but I was paralyzed with terror. The entity began moving toward the stairs, toward me, toward my family upstairs. As it moved, the temperature dropped even further, and I could feel my strength being drained away. Let me know in the comments what you think I should have done, because my next decision saved my family's life. Somehow I found the strength to speak. "You can't have them," I managed to whisper. "They're innocent. They never did anything to invite you here." The entity stopped moving and turned those terrible hollow eyes directly on me. Innocence makes them more valuable, not less. Their pure energy will sustain me for decades. Their fear will feed me. Their souls will anchor me permanently to this realm. That's when I understood what Margaret Thorne had really been doing in our basement. She hadn't just been practicing ritual magic. She had been trying to trade human souls, specifically children's souls, for supernatural power. The entity had been waiting 37 years for someone with children to move into the house so it could complete the bargain Margaret had started, but never finished. But I also realized something else. The entity couldn't leave the basement. That's why it had always appeared to the children from a distance, why it had tried to lure Jake downstairs, why it had never actually entered their bedrooms. It was bound to the space where it had been summoned, trapped by the same ritual magic that had brought it into our world. Subscribe for more supernatural survival stories, because understanding the entity's limitations gave me the courage to fight back. If you want them, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. You'll have to come upstairs and get them. But you can't leave this basement, can you? You're trapped here just like you've been trapped for decades. The entity's roar of rage confirmed my theory. It was bound to the basement by the original summoning ritual. That's why Margaret had eventually been attacked. She had tried to dismiss the entity without giving it what it wanted, and it had turned on her in fury. The Hendersons had been safe because they never spent significant time in the basement and had regular spiritual protection throughout the rest of the house. But the entity still had the 3 priests under its control, and I knew it could use them to harm my family. I had to break whatever hold it had over them and find a way to complete the exorcism. I remembered something Father Mackenzie had taught us during our preparation, that speaking the entity's true name could break its power over others. But how could I learn its name? Comment below if you think I was crazy for what I did next, because I made a deal with the devil to save my family. I'll make you a bargain, I said to the entity. Tell me your true name, and I'll bring Jake down here voluntarily. No more games, no more trying to lure him. I'll deliver him to you myself. The entity's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. You would sacrifice your own child to learn my name? How deliciously evil. Very well. I am Malphus, builder of towers, destroyer of enemies' desires. I was summoned by the woman Margaret to grant her power over her enemies, but she was too weak to pay the price I demanded. As soon as the entity spoke its name, I felt the knowledge burning itself into my mind. But I also felt something else. The true name gave me power over it, just as Father Mackenzie had said it would. Malphus, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. I bind you by your true name, and by the power of the innocent souls you seek to claim. You have no authority over the priests, you have no claim to my children, and you will return to the void from which you came. Hit the like button if you're amazed that my desperate gamble actually worked, because what happened next was like watching a supernatural battle unfold. The moment I spoke the binding words, all 3 priests snapped out of their trance. Father Mackenzie immediately resumed the exorcism prayers, his voice strong and clear. Father Rodriguez began sprinkling holy water in a circle around the glowing pentagram, and Father Thomas held up a large crucifix that seemed to radiate its own pure white light. Malphus screamed with rage and pain as the holy water hit the glowing stains. The greenish light began flickering and dimming, and the entity's form started becoming less solid, more like smoke than shadow. "You cannot banish me," Malphus roared. "I was summoned with blood and bound with souls. The ritual cannot be undone." But Father Mackenzie knew something the entity didn't. The ritual was never completed, Malphus. Margaret Thorne never paid the price you demanded. She summoned you, but never gave you what you were promised. That means your binding to this realm is imperfect, and an imperfect binding can be broken by the power of perfect love. Share your own experiences with spiritual warfare in the comments, because what Father Mackenzie did next was the most powerful display of faith I've ever witnessed. Father Mackenzie stepped directly into the center of the pentagram, placing himself between Malphus and the rest of us. The entity tried to attack him, reaching out with those impossibly long fingers, but the priest's faith created a barrier that the darkness couldn't penetrate. "I cast you out, Malphus, in the name of all that is holy and pure," Father Mackenzie declared. "You have no power here over the innocent. You have no claim on this family. Return to the void and trouble this world no more." The entity's screams became deafening as it began to dissolve. The greenish light flickered and went out. The glowing stains faded back to their original dark brown, and the temperature in the basement began to return to normal. But Malphus wasn't finished fighting. In its final moments before banishment, the entity made one last desperate attempt to claim a victim. It lunged not at me or the priests, but toward the stairs, trying to reach my family upstairs. For a terrifying moment, I thought it might break free of the basement's binding and actually reach my children. But then something beautiful happened. Let me know in the comments if you believe in the power of a parent's love, because what stopped Malphus wasn't any religious ritual or ancient prayer. As the entity reached the bottom of the basement stairs, it suddenly stopped as if it had hit an invisible wall. Above us, I could hear Sarah's voice, strong and clear, as she sang a lullaby she used to sing to Emma and Jake when they were babies. It was a simple song about angels watching over sleeping children, but her voice was filled with such pure love and protective power that the entity couldn't move past it. "The love of a mother for her children," Father Mackenzie said, his own voice filled with awe, "is one of the purest forms of divine love that exists in this world. No entity of darkness can overcome it." Malphus gave one final, frustrated scream, then collapsed into itself like a black hole closing. The basement was suddenly filled with brilliant white light, and when the light faded, the entity was gone. The cracks in the concrete floor sealed themselves, the dark stains disappeared completely, and the oppressive feeling that had plagued our house for months lifted like fog in sunlight. The exorcism was complete. Our family was safe. Subscribe and hit that notification bell if you want to hear more stories about families who fought supernatural evil and won, because our battle with Malphus taught us lessons that every family should know. In the days following the exorcism, our house felt completely different. The children started sleeping through the night again without nightmares. Emma began playing alone in her room without fear. Jake stopped sleepwalking and returned to his normal, cheerful personality. Even our neighbors commented that our house seemed brighter somehow, as if a shadow had been lifted from the entire property. Father Mackenzie visited us several times over the following weeks to make sure the entity hadn't returned. He explained that successful exorcisms sometimes take time to fully settle, and that malevolent entities occasionally try to return to places where they were once welcome. But our house remained peaceful and felt like a true home for the first time since we'd moved in. We also learned more about Margaret Thorne's story. Father Mackenzie had researched her case extensively after our experience, and he discovered that Margaret hadn't started practicing occult magic with evil intentions. She had initially been trying to contact her deceased husband, who had died in a car accident in 1952. Her grief had made her vulnerable to darker influences, and what began as innocent attempts to communicate with her husband's spirit had gradually escalated into dangerous ritual magic. Margaret's story is a warning, Father Mackenzie told us. When we try to open doorways to the spiritual realm without proper knowledge and protection, we can't control what comes through those doorways. She thought she was summoning her husband's spirit, but instead she invited something much darker into our world. Comment below if you've ever been tempted to use Ouija boards or other methods to contact deceased loved ones, because Margaret's story shows how dangerous grief-driven spiritual experimentation can be. The most important lesson we learned from our supernatural ordeal was about the power of family love and faith. When we had relied only on logic and rationalization to explain away the supernatural activity, the entity had grown stronger. When we had trusted in external religious authority alone, the exorcism had nearly failed. But when we combined faith with the protective power of parental love, the entity couldn't overcome us. Sarah and I also learned to trust our children's instincts about spiritual matters. Kids often sense supernatural presences more clearly than adults because they haven't yet learned to rationalize away their intuitive responses. If Emma and Jake ever tell us they feel something wrong in a place or situation, we listen to them now without question. Our relationship with our neighbors improved dramatically after the exorcism. Mrs. Chen was the first to notice the change in our house's energy, and she finally felt comfortable sharing more details about what she had witnessed during the Henderson years. She told us that the Hendersons had performed monthly house blessings and had installed blessed metals above every doorway, specifically to keep the basement entity contained. They were good people who inherited a bad situation, Mrs. Chen explained. They managed the problem as best they could, but they should have told you the truth when they sold the house. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. Let me know in the comments if you think sellers should be required to disclose supernatural activity when selling a house, because our experience showed how unprepared most families are for dealing with inherited spiritual contamination. We decided to stay in the house after the successful exorcism. The entity was gone, the basement had been purified, and we had invested too much time, money, and emotional energy to give up on our dream home. But we also took precautions that we maintain to this day. We had Father Mackenzie perform annual house blessings every October, around the anniversary of our supernatural crisis. We installed blessed metals above all our doorways, and we keep holy water in a small font by our front door. Most importantly, we maintain regular family prayer time, and have taught Emma and Jake specific prayers to recite if they ever feel spiritually threatened. The basement became the family room we had originally planned, but we made one significant change to our renovation plans. Instead of the entertainment center I had envisioned, we installed a small shrine with family photos, religious symbols from various faith traditions, and a candle that we keep lit as a symbol of the divine light that protects our home. Share this video with other families who might be dealing with unexplained supernatural activity, because recognizing the signs early can prevent situations from escalating to dangerous levels. 3 years have passed since our supernatural ordeal, and our house remains peaceful and happy. Emma is now 11 and has developed a strong interest in studying different world religions and their approaches to spiritual protection. Jake, now 13, has become fascinated with the scientific study of paranormal phenomena and wants to become a paranormal investigator when he grows up. Sarah and I have become much more spiritually aware and protective of our family's energy and environment. We research the history of any place we plan to visit or live. We trust our instincts about places and people that feel wrong to us, and we maintain strong spiritual practices that keep our family grounded in love and light. We've also become resources for other families dealing with supernatural problems. Father Mackenzie occasionally refers people to us who are experiencing similar situations, and we've helped several families recognize and address spiritual contamination in their homes. It's become a ministry of sorts, using our traumatic experience to help others avoid or overcome similar dangers. The most important thing we learned is that supernatural evil is real, but supernatural good is more powerful. Entities like Malphus feed on fear, isolation, and spiritual weakness. But when families stand together in faith, love, and courage, no darkness can overcome them. Subscribe for more true supernatural horror stories and paranormal survival guides, because knowledge and preparation are your best defenses against spiritual threats. I often think about Margaret Thorne and wonder if her story could have ended differently. If she had sought help from religious authorities when her grief first led her toward occult practices, if she had found a healthy way to process her husband's death, if she had recognized the dangers of ritual magic before it was too late, her life might have been very different, and our family might never have faced supernatural danger. But I also believe that everything happens for a reason. Our experience with Malphus strengthened our family bonds, deepened our faith, and gave us knowledge that we've been able to use to help others. We survived something that could have destroyed us, and we came out stronger on the other side. If you're currently dealing with unexplained supernatural activity in your home, please don't ignore it or try to rationalize it away. Trust your instincts, seek help from qualified religious authorities, and remember that you don't have to face spiritual dangers alone. There are people who understand what you're going through, and resources available to help you reclaim your home and protect your family. Comment below with your own supernatural experiences or questions about spiritual protection, because sharing our stories helps all of us stay safer and more aware. Most importantly, never forget that love is the most powerful force in any realm, physical or spiritual. The love between family members, the love of the divine for humanity, and the love that connects all living beings can overcome any darkness. When we stand together in love and refuse to be divided by fear, no evil entity can claim victory over us. Our house is now truly our home, a place of peace, joy, and spiritual safety where our children can grow up protected by both human love and divine grace. The basement that once housed occult rituals and malevolent entities is now filled with the laughter of family game nights and the warmth of togetherness. Evil may be real, but good is eternal. Darkness may be powerful, but light always wins in the end. Hit that like button if this story gave you hope along with the chills, subscribe for more supernatural survival stories, and remember, you're stronger than any darkness that might try to claim you. Let me know in the comments if you want to hear more about the other families we've helped with supernatural problems, because there are so many more stories of ordinary people overcoming extraordinary evil through faith, love, and courage. Thank you for listening to our story. May your home always be filled with light, and may you never have to face the darkness alone.